Li Sun looked at Futian with a smile. Our Dali dynasty is full of talent. Even the people of the lower worlds are standing at the peak below the Saint Plain. I am looking forward to the future of Dali dynasty. Li Sun looked at Futian with a smile. Our Dali dynasty is full of talent. Even the people of the lower worlds are standing at the peak below the Saint Plain. I am looking forward to the future of Dali dynasty. Next to Li Sun, the imperial advisor of Dali also looked at Futian. The fortune of Dali was changing, and there could be turmoil in the future. However, he could not yet see the cause of the change in fortune. Dali dynasty was prosperous. It had many strong cultivators in its command. Even though he had had words with the two kings of Dali, he would still avoid the conflict with the two kings at all costs. Their ideologies slightly conflicted, but they were all acting in the best interest of Dali, and no one dared to trespass. Otherwise, even the two kings would not be able to afford the anger of the emperor of Dali. This seeker was a wild card, and came from the lower worlds. Would he be the one? Seventh swordsman, the imperial advisor called out. Suddenly Futian looked toward the imperial advisor of Dali. This was the first time he looked at the imperial advisor. Because the other had called out to him, he could look back at the imperial advisor with good reason. I heard Lu Chuan saying that you cultivated in the lower worlds and were enlightened. You comprehended the swordsmanship in 30 years, with nature and heaven and earth as your teacher? Asked the imperial advisor. Yes, Futian nodded. His battle techniques had integrated the way of all things in the world into his swordsmanship and turned it into sword arts that was without weakness. The sun, the ice, the storm, the thunder, and lightning, even the way of space, contained all things of the universe. Although it seemed that his talent was rather particular, among the many cultivators of the Dali dynasty, having such one genius was not surprising. Your life spirit, let me take a look, the advisor of Dali said. He hadn't seen Futian's life spirit. What kind of life spirit could comprehend the way of all things in heaven and earth? Futian's heart trembled slightly. At this moment he was a little nervous. He was unambiguous that possessing such talent would naturally cause the curiosity of those in power in Dali. To cultivators, the life spirit was vital. The request from the imperial advisor of Dali to see his life spirit was not because he doubted his identity. No one would see a genius and immediately suspect that this person was a fraud. This was not a rational thought process. Perhaps the imperial advisor of Dali wanted to know how this swordsman from the lower worlds was so outstanding. He also knew what came next would be the key, and he had already thought about it. Very well. Many thoughts that flooded his mind, but Futian did not hesitate to agree. In the Life Palace, a sword shuttled around the ancient tree of the world. A rustling came from the ancient tree. Curious aura blended into the sword will and surrounded the sword. Subsequently, the sword whistled and rushed out of the Life Palace. Outside, a brilliant sword rocketed upward, and this sword was incredibly radiant. The instant he appeared, the worldly spiritual qi could not resist but gather together. It was as if this sword had an affinity with all the other spiritual qi of the universe. The sword crossed in the void and was gone in a flash. Then it buried itself into Futian and returned to his Life Palace. The attention of the imperial advisor of Dali landed on Futian. In this instant, although Futian stood there quietly, he was very nervous inside. He did not know whether or not the will of the ancient tree of the world that he had integrated into the sword will had any flaws. He had tested it before. In his opinion, there were no issues. The cultivators of the world were endless, and it was the same with life spirits. Many people's particular life spirits carried with them various attributes. No matter what power of attributes his life spirit was carrying, it was also entirely reasonable. The sword spirit in harmony with nature and heaven and earth is a considered full attribute. You are indeed suitable to be taught by all things in the universe and refine the all-method swordsmanship. If you could render harmony between them, there would be no sword you could not master. The imperial advisor of Dali nodded slightly and was not surprised. It was as if the full attribute sword spirit was completely expected. Otherwise, how could all things of the universe be its master? Moreover, Yi Futian's sword spirit not only had an affinity toward the full attribute, but he also perceived an incredibly fantastic force. It was as if he was born to fit into the way of the world. His perception was not incorrect, but what he sensed belonged to the life spirit of the ancient tree of the world, which caused him to misjudge. Imperial Advisor, it seems that Lu Chuan brought us an amazing genius of the swordsmanship from the lower worlds. He smiled and said, 7 swordsmen, are your parents still in the lower worlds? I don't know who my parents were. Yi Futian's tone was a bit cold, and it seemed to reflect a faint sadness, but it was the truth. It was true that until now, he still did not know who his biological parents were. That old guy, Yi Baichuan, did not tell him anything, and now he was missing. And his godfather had never mentioned it either. It was as if he was an orphan. Li Sun nodded lightly and did not say anything more. You may go, the Imperial Advisor said. Yi Futian nodded, and then returned to his seat on the side of Li Yu in a flash. When Li Yu looked toward him, there was a strange color in her beautiful eyes. She said with a smile, It seems that I underestimated you, the first swordsman below Saint Plain in Dali. The road of cultivation is without end, but the first sword below Saint Plain in Dali is nothing to be boastful of, Yi Futian said calmly. Li Yu blinked her eyes, and this dignified and noble princess revealed her side as a lady. You are a sword idiot. Li Yu laughed softly, and her beautiful eyes stared straight ahead. Zuozong, 7 Sins, Jianwu, and Yi Futian had made exchanges. For the forum battle of the Dali Academy, who else would now dare to step out? The few people before were already peak figures beside Di Hao and Dong Chen. Even if they stepped onto the forum platform, they would not exceed anyone's expectations. This space was silent for some moments, and many eyes looked at the two figures. One stood in front of the crowd of the Dali Academy, while the other in front of Daily Mountain. Next would be these two battling for glory. Today, Daily Mountain came to visit and seek instruction. These people came to Dali Academy to serve as witnesses of this moment. At this moment, Di Hao stepped out. He did not reveal any expression from beginning to end. Even though Yi Futian defeated 7 Sins in one sword strike, he still looked as if nothing had happened. He came today with only one goal, to defeat the best disciple of the Dali Academy, Dong Chen. Di Hao walked onto the forum platform and looked in the direction of the Dali Academy, and said, Di Hao of Daily Mountain, asking for your instruction. The clothes upon his body moved without wind. A solemn atmosphere shrouded this space. Soon after, everyone saw that Dong Chen had stepped out and stood opposite Di Hao. There was no breath released from either one of them, but there was an invisible wind blowing, which was caused by both of their auras. Dali Dynasty, below the Saint Plain, 2 figures at the peak. At this time, an invisible storm swept out and beat on Dong Chen's body. He felt that this force oppressed his soul and was extremely suffocating. Di Hao was still standing there, but it seemed that he was everywhere. At this time, Di Hao stepped forward and walked out.
Dong.
A bell ring sounded across the land, causing a devastating spiritual storm between heaven and earth. When it swept through, Dong Chen closed his eyes slightly and felt that his spiritual will was shaking. He felt a very strong sound wave blast out, intending to erase his spiritual will. God-burying bell. Many elders from the Dali Academy had seen and known many things, and in just a moment, they had identified the kind of magical power of this sound wave attack. This was a kind of sound magic. It could disregard defensive forces and shatter the spiritual willpower of others through the air, destroying others' minds. It was incomparably aggressive. Although the others' understanding of Di Hao was limited, they did not doubt that his power was great. Otherwise, no one would have named him the first person below Saint Plain in Dali. Now, when they heard this god-burying bell, many knew that Dong Chen was in big trouble. The god-burying bell was an aggressive mental attack, capable of greatly damaging the spiritual power of Dong Chen, thus weakening his combat effectiveness. It was not probable for this to be the only kind of ability that Di Hao was an expert in. There must be other extremely strong methods he had at his disposal. Dong Chen closed his eyes, and there was a mighty storm of spiritual power that appeared upon his body, which blended with the heavens and the earth. It echoed with the great path. Suddenly, he was covered with dazzling brilliance.
Dong.
Another bell ring rocked the world, sweeping toward them. In front of Dong Chen, the invisible spiritual attack materialized and turned into half-shadows of the ancient bell. It blasted toward him. This was a compelling and mystical method of the Dali Academy, which could make the spiritual power materialize. Dali Academy was built by Emperor of Dali, according to the specifications of the Imperial Advisor, and contained many mysterious and compelling methods. Dong Chen was the first person of the younger generations of Dali Academy, so he cultivated many great and powerful abilities. Di Hao continued moving forward, and the bell kept ringing. The invisible storm turned into bell rings that continued to attack Dong Chen. At this moment, Dong Chen's fingers stretched out, and above the 5 fingers of his right hand, radiant and mysterious brilliance encircled them. At the moment, the half-shadows of the ancient bell attacked, his fingers pressed down toward the front, and there seemed to be hundreds of thousands of fingers of catastrophe that reached out, blasting upon the ancient bell and destroyed it into smithereens. But at this point, Di Hao's aura had already elevated to an extremely dominant level. Both of his hands stretched out, and suddenly, there was a large sacred tripod, hundreds of meters high, that appeared behind him. The sacred tripod rotated, and there was a crushing atmosphere appearing above the firmament. On the area above the forum platform, many tripods appeared at the same time, suspended in midair. It was as if they were all controlled by Di Hao. The tripods spun at the same time, gathering a terrifying storm of suppression. From those tripods, images of the dragon and elephant could be faintly detected. Its might suffocated the sky, and everything was on the verge of being flattened and overruled. Tripod of dragon and elephant. The cultivators of Dali Academy looked up. It was yet another aggressive attack. The tripod in itself was a symbol of suppression. Most cultivators who cultivated in the method of tripods were experts at suppression rules power. And the tripod of dragon and elephant was the most excellent method among them. The tripod integrated the power of the dragon and elephant and could even suppress the Great Path. Many of the disciples of the Dali Academy and Daily Mountain felt that their feet were floating. Those whose cultivation was weaker felt their legs slightly trembling. Even if they were not located below, they still felt oppressed and had difficulty breathing. Many of the disciples of the Dali Academy had a look of unease on their faces. Di Hao's strength was simply beyond imagination. Was this the might of the way that someone in the sage plane could release? It was just like the might of the divine path. Dong Chen was just underneath the might, and the pressure he felt was naturally the strongest. Dong Chen was just underneath the might, and the pressure he felt was naturally the strongest. The radiance on his body was still brilliant, and the thousands of fingers of catastrophe pointed to attack the invisible ancient bell of the Great Path. But at this moment, the bell and the tripod both hummed. The bell shattered the souls of men, annihilating the divine spirit. The tripod crushed everything, oppressed the physical body. The tripod of dragon and elephant suppressed the Great Path. Both of Dong Chen's hands made the mudra, and suddenly, there was a crisp clinking sound from his body. There was a terrible radiance shining upon him, and suddenly the battle form of Vajra appeared, which grew larger and larger, reaching as high as hundreds of meters, just like the battle form of the Great Path. Moreover, the battle form of Vajra gave birth to many arms, and the will of the Great Path flowed, and all the arms simultaneously struck. The immense palms contained horrific mudra method. The elders of the Dali Academy nodded slightly. Dong Chen was the premier disciple below Saint Plane in the Dali Academy. Now, he combined the battle form of will and 2 other magical means to create a perfect blend of power, exploding amazing power. Dong Chen, whose comprehension of the cultivation had always been strong, so he could understand the true meaning within. The tripod of dragon and elephant dropped down and wiped out everything. The great palm of Vajra blasted upon it and caused a violent hurricane. The clothes of those who were around watching the battle had fluttered uncontrollably, and the might of the path blasting toward them. Those sages whose realm were lower were blasted backward, and it was difficult for them to remain standing.
Dong.
Di Hao was still moving forward, and the bell rings shook the sky. The tripod of dragon and elephant, like a divine tripod, with golden rays came out of it, just like the light of the great path, directed toward Dong Chen. At this moment, everyone seemed to be able to perceive just how strong the oppressive force that Dong Chen was enduring. That immense and incomparable Vajra battle form seemed to be on the verge of being crushed.
Dong.
A loud bang, and numerous lines of light appeared on Dong Chen's battle form, extending along the battle form toward the arms. Above the sky, numerous arms blasted out at the same time, creating an extremely brilliant golden pattern from which endless brilliance exuded and collided with the light from the divine tripod. The two forces were jousting with one another. Di Hao stretched out both of his hands, his robe fluttered, and a mighty aura bloomed from him, which then turned extremely sharp. With his body as the center, there was a sudden storm of sword will, and behind him a glorious golden sword appeared. He is also good at swordsmanship? Everyone looked on with shock. Di Hao had already released 3 major life spirits. All of them were martial spirits. Bell, tripod, sword. At the moment, he stood on the forum platform like the king of the divine soldiers. When the sword will was whistling, the infinite sword will once again gathered in front of him. Under the gaze of everyone, the sword of Kasayapa that was previously used by 7 sins was once again manifesting. Sword of Kasayapa, Di Hao knows it too. Many disciples of the younger generation were trembling in their hearts and extremely shocked. Moreover, the sword of Kasayapa from Di Hao was even stronger than that of the 7 sins. Many people showed a look of curiosity. Everyone had thought the battle of the swordsmanship had ended, but no one expected Di Hao was also good at the sword. However, the sword spirit was only one of Di Hao's life spirits, of which he had 3 major ones, and each one of them was extremely aggressive. If Yi Futian claimed that his previous fight with 7 sins, there were flaws with 7 sins, then Di Hao was undoubtedly perfect without any faults. The bell rings suppressed the spiritual willpower. The tripod of dragon and elephant suppressed all things, and now with the rebirth of the swordsmanship, how tyrannical was this strength? The people of Daily Mountain appeared calm without any look of surprise. Naturally, they knew how strong Di Hao was. Even 7 sins was observing the battle calmly. His own strength was already incredibly strong. There were few rivals below the Saint Plain who could be his equal, and in the entire Dali Imperial City there were hardly anyone who could counter him. This was why he could defeat number 2 of the Dali Academy, Zuozong, with overwhelming advantage. However, Di Hao was someone that he admired greatly, and was also someone that he felt he could never surpass. With Di Hao around, everyone else could only fight for the second spot. Although he was very strong, if he had fought with Di Hao, he would be defeated very badly. Whether it was from the beginning or allowing him to release the Sword of the Peak, he would be crushed either way. There was no need to stop him from gathering the Sword of Kasayapa as the 7th swordsman had done. Imperial Advisor, Dong Chen seemed to be under great pressure. Li Sun said to the man next to him, "I had no idea that uncle had adopted such a powerful godson." The Imperial Advisor of Dali looked at the battlefield quietly. The strength of Di Hao was indeed at the apex below Saint Plain. Such ability was nearly invincible. Swords of Kasayapa now gathered and manifested. Unlike 7 sins, Di Hao could gather multiple swords of Kasayapa, and in an instant the swords whistled in the sky. The bell was still ringing, and the tripod of dragon and elephant was still in a deadlock with Dong Chen, and with such terrifying swordsmanship suppressing, it could only be imagined just how much pressure Dong Chen was facing.
Dong.
A loud bang, and the many arms of Dong Chen were unleashed at the same time, and the currents upon his body were extremely aggressive. He then went in the direction of Di Hao. Not only did he not retreat, but instead he headed toward the other. Go! Di Hao's fingers pointed toward the front, and the sword of Kasayapa penetrated the void, reaching the limit of speed.
Buzz.
At this moment, there were many afterimages appeared in front, and they were all images of Dongchen, and these images seemed to be as real as could be. The swords of Cassiopeia whizzed by, and all the afterimages were shattered, and yet other images were constantly condensing and appear, and seemed to be increasing. Not only that, but above these condensing illusions, there was also an extremely powerful spiritual will. Di Hao actually felt threatened. Suddenly the tripod of dragon and elephant flew back, and appeared in the area above him. The vastness of the might descended. He continued to move forward, and the bell and the tripod sounded at the same time. His palms pushed out, and the swords of Cassiopeia that were whistling suddenly ran through the void, and madly slaughtered in the space, wanting to smash and pulverize the space, and destroy all the images of Dongchen. Above the sword of Cassiopeia, there was a great murderous intent hidden within. This was the powerful murderous will that Di Hao had refined from his experience on the battlefield.
Dong.
The Vajra battle form exploded from an afterimage, blocking the sword will that was madly attacking. At the same moment, the battle form rushed forward and directly oppressing Di Hao's true location. Di Hao showed no fear. The tripod of dragon and elephant descended from the sky, destroyed everything, and blasted toward the battle form. The many arms of the battle form raised up to support the tripod of dragon and elephant. Dongchen's body carried the radiant glory with him as he moved forward. He was surrounded by a sacred light, as if it was not below the saint plane any longer, but had already entered the presence of the divine path. Di Hao's hands closed together, and the swordsmanship surrounding him hummed together. The sword of Cassiopeia broke through from the sky. With the body of Dongchen as the center, it was attacking instantly, fast as can be. Many disciples of the Dali Academy clenched their fists tightly and revealed a look of worry on their faces. At this moment, the sword of Cassiopeia and millions of sword will came together, shattering the void, and was completely indefensible. But Dongchen did not pay any attention to it and just continued moving forward. When the sword came for the attack, it passed through his body. Just as the sword about to descend on Dongchen, it stopped abruptly. The glory on Dongchen shrouded the space within it. The sword screamed wildly, and Di Hao stepped forward again. His fingers extended, continued the command for the sword to attack. A loud sound was heard, and in this moment, Dongchen's body split once again, producing bodies outside of bodies, colliding directly with the swords of Cassiopeia, and was crushed by the swords.
Buzz.
The might of great path descended in front of Di Hao, and a phantom image penetrated the attack of swordsmanship and came in front of Di Hao. Dongchen's body seemed to be unreal. His fingers pressed down toward Di Hao, who was in front. In an instant, heaven and earth were suffocated. Everything seemed to be at a standstill, with only this one finger existing. When this one finger went down, the great path descended, and Di Hao only felt that his soul was going to be broken. He knew that Dongchen's strongest attacking technique was the God Destroyer. The powerful spiritual will that he released was shattered. The invisible force enveloped his body and seemed to take apart his soul.
Dong.
A glorious ancient bell surrounded his body, as if it was one with his body, and like Dongchen, one of his fingers also pointed forward. With this finger, the heaven and earth resonated, the great path connected, sharper than sword, and contained supreme way of suppression. The fingers of the two men collided together and suddenly formed an atmosphere of total destruction. The flesh and the spiritual will seem to be crushed. Bell, tripod, and the sword all hummed, intending to shatter the great path.
Boom.
A loud bang, the light of destruction swept out, and the people only saw the two bodies were shocked backward at the same time. Di Hao retreated unsteadily and let out a groan. Dongchen's body flew backwards. It seemed that there was a murderous sword will that penetrated the body, and inside the body there came a roaring sound.
Pooh.
He spat out a mouthful of blood, looking pale. Dongchen, defeated. The hearts of the people trembled. Dongchen, the first person below the Saint Plane from Dali Academy, was defeated. Di Hao of Daily Mountain, godson of King Tiandao, the first person below Saint Plain in Dali dynasty. Much obliged, Di Hao put his hands together and bowed. His clothes fluttered, as he said to Dong Chen. Although he had won, but he still respected Dong Chen's strength. Dong Chen also saluted, then retired, without saying anything more. Defeat was defeat. In this battle, he had shouldered great responsibility, but he still lost. Daily Mountain came to seek the way and triumphed over the first holy land of cultivation in Dali dynasty, the Dali Academy. After the shock, many people looked at the imperial advisor, only to see him sitting there, looking casual, and no one had any idea what he was thinking. This battle can be said to be the battle of the peaks below Saint Plain in Dali, Imperial City. Di Hao took a few steps forward, looking at the imperial advisor of Dali, and bowed gently, saying, "I heard that the imperial advisor wanted to take on apprentices, so I came from Daily Mountain asked to be instructed by the Dali Academy. I would like to be accepted under the imperial advisor as an apprentice." When Di Hao finished speaking, everyone was stupefied in a moment. Dong Chen came to the Dali Imperial City when the imperial advisor had wanted to accept disciples, and everyone thought that Dong Chen would become a disciple of the imperial advisor. In the eyes of many, Di Hao's arrival was undoubtedly to provoke trouble. But at this moment, Di Hao claimed that he had come to Dali dynasty to seek the way and that he wanted to be the apprentice of the imperial advisor to continue to cultivate. How could the people not be shocked? Dong Chen was even more pale, but he sighed. He was defeated and had no qualification whatsoever to apprentice under the imperial advisor. Once again, everyone looked to the imperial advisor. As the first person below Saint Plain, Di Hao had requested to be his apprentice. Would the imperial advisor agree? The imperial advisor of Dai was also surprised by Di Hao's request, but he soon recovered. Obviously, this was also not unexpected. There were many cultivators in Dali Academy, but at that moment, they were all quiet, and most of them were looking at the imperial advisor and Di Hao. No one had expected this to happen. The disciples of Dali Academy were all in extremely low spirits. After all, they had lost terribly as Daily Mountain came to seek the path. There were many cultivators in Dali Academy, but at that moment, they were all quiet, and most of them were looking at the imperial advisor and Di Hao. No one had expected this to happen. The disciples of Dali Academy were all in extremely low spirits. After all, they had lost terribly as Daily Mountain came to seek the path. Although they had won the first battle of lower-level sages, after the seven sins had come forward, it had seemed that that battle had only happened for the purpose of educating Kuang Shao. He had used the sword of Cassiopeia to defeat Zhuozong. Next, Di Hao had defeated Dong Chen and had asked to be taken as the disciple of the headmaster of Dali Academy, the imperial advisor of the Dali dynasty. This was naturally hard to bear for the disciples of Dali Academy. However, Di Hao had wanted to be taken as a disciple and had let everybody know it. Even though Dali Academy, which he founded, had been defeated, he was still second only to Emperor Li. Why else would King Tiandao have sent his adopted son to be trained by him? No matter what their goal was, this was a recognition of the imperial advisor's power and position. The imperial advisor looked up at Di Hao and asked him, "If you want to become my disciple, you must tell me, why do you seek the path?" Di Hao stared at him. His adopted father, King Tiandao, had once told him that he looked at the imperial advisor as an opponent, but at the same time, he still respected him greatly. That was because people of talent appreciated each other. Thus, he had sent him to become the imperial advisor's disciple, learning from him and seeking the path with him. That was why he had come here for today's battle. I seek the path to be able to sweep over the battlefield and plan victory from 1,000 miles away. To be able to protect the Dali dynasty from within and sweep away all external threats and make the Dali dynasty prosperous, said Di Hao. All the people of Daily Mountain had trained in the army, and so his thoughts were naturally those of a soldier. He wanted to conquer the world, sweep away all threats, and seize resources of the great path.
Oh.
The imperial advisor nodded slightly, then looked away. Di Hao felt himself relax quite a bit. Before, when the imperial advisor had been looking at him, he had felt like he was under a lot of pressure. Under that pressure, if he had spoken insincerely, the imperial advisor would have perceived it. As for whether or not the imperial advisor was satisfied with what he had said, he did not know. The imperial advisor had cultivated himself so highly that he could see right through him, but he could not see through to the imperial advisor's thoughts. Dong Chun, called the imperial advisor. Dong Chun suddenly stepped forward. "Headmaster," he said. The imperial advisor was also the headmaster of Dali Academy, and so there was nothing improper about calling him headmaster there. "Lift your head," said the imperial advisor. Dong Chun lifted his head, and in that instant, felt the same thing that Di Hao had, an invisible pressure. Those deep and wise eyes seemed to pierce right through him, looking into his very soul. Even if he was not purposely putting pressure on him, the force that Dong Chun felt was still great. When one had cultivated to the peak of the saint level, if he willed it, his every move would be like the authority of heaven. "And you? Why do you seek the path?" asked the imperial advisor. When they heard what the imperial advisor said, the disciples of Dali Academy had hope once again. When choosing a disciple, he would not just rely on talent and power. Perhaps Dong Chun still had hope. "I seek the path to seek knowledge. I want to see great things and be like you, teaching the path to the people of the Dali dynasty, to increase their levels of cultivation," said Dong Chun with a bow. The imperial advisor was an idol to the students of Dali Academy, and they worshipped him. Even Dong Chun, the #1 junior at the academy, was the same. His respect and worship for the imperial advisor were no less than anyone else's. Thus, Dong Chun's goal was everything that the imperial advisor had now. He wanted to become like the imperial advisor, and so he took him as a model.
Oh.
The imperial advisor nodded again, just like with Di Hao. No one could see if he was pleased or displeased, or which one of them he favored. Everyone felt a bit uneasy as they saw the imperial advisor turn his gaze and look into the crowd. Finally, his eyes fell upon Yi Futian. He said, "Seven swordsmen, Lu Chuan has praised you highly, and Sword Mountain has come for you. Why is it that you seek the path of swordsmanship?" A shocked look came over everyone's faces as they heard this. The imperial advisor was questioning seventh swordsman. Could it be that he was considering him as well? Yi Futian looked up at the imperial advisor and then stepped forward. The imperial advisor looked at him, and suddenly he had the same feeling that Dong Chun and Di Hao had had. "I seek the path of swordsmanship to reach the highest level of swordsmanship, master," answered Yi Futian. He avoided the imperial advisor's gaze, keeping his head down. The imperial advisor kept looking at him, then said calmly, "Look up at me. You seek the path only to improve your swordsmanship?" It seemed that he knew Yi Futian had not spoken the truth. Yi Futian could only look up into the imperial advisor's eyes. He had a feeling that if he spoke falsely, the imperial advisor would see through him. At that moment, Yi Futian thought of his cultivation, not just his swordsmanship. Why did he seek the path? The incident at Donghai, the unstable situation at Nandu, the chaos at East Baron College, the disaster of the Baron State. As he thought of this, Yi Futian's heart was like still water. He looked at the imperial advisor and said, "When I was young I was often bullied, and thus I put my whole heart towards cultivating. You asked me why I seek the path. I do so that one day I can be carefree and happy. And on that day, even if I don't cultivate, I will still have the right to choose freely." Everyone looked at Yi Futian. It seemed that seven swordsmen also had this side to him. Of course, this also appeared to be the wish of the vast majority of common cultivators. The people of this world all face a difficult choice. Having the right to choose freely is not easy at all, and if you don't cultivate, then even if you don't try to get involved in the affairs of the world, you might still be affected, said the imperial advisor. "Your requirements are a bit high?" Yi Futian nodded. "That is indeed the way it is, and that is why the only option is to seek the path." He did not speak of the path of swordsmanship. He just talked about the path, openly and honestly. Di Hao and Dong Chun both care about the cultivation of all the people in the world, but when you seek the path, you do it only for yourself, said the imperial advisor. Man first loves himself, then may he love others. He first establishes himself, then he may talk about doing good for humanity, answered Futian. Is this the boundary that you are cultivating towards? The imperial advisor seemed a bit interested as he continued to ask Futian questions. Futian thought of Mr. Du's wishes and thought of his path of cultivation so far. He looked at the imperial advisor and said, "The great path knows no boundaries." The imperial advisor nodded and said nothing. Li Sun looked at Futian with a smile and said, "What you have said is quite interesting, Seventh Swordsman. The poor think only of themselves, while the distinguished work for the good of the whole world, no? And as for the great path having no boundaries, the whole world is bounded. How can there be no boundaries?" "What you have said is so, Your Majesty. I was speaking foolishly." Futian would naturally not contradict him. He was an imperial prince. They were on entirely different levels. To each their own. What you said was not foolish. In fact, I think it was very interesting, said Li Sun with a smile. Who will you choose as your disciple, imperial advisor? Today, the imperial advisor of Dali dynasty would choose a disciple to teach personally. He was very curious. Would it be Di Hao, or would he still select Chen Dong? Dong Chen was the one that most people had expected him to choose. And his ideals were well suited to everything that the imperial advisor had done up till now. Of course, Di Hao had defeated Dong Chen and had actively asked to be accepted as a disciple. His goals for cultivation took different roads to the same place with Dong Chen's. There was not a huge difference in their characters. As for Futian, people generally thought that he was best suited for Sword Mountain. Pursuing the path of swordsmanship comfortably and naturally was their way. "I will announce my choice in 3 days," said the imperial advisor. Everyone looked surprised. He had originally intended to choose his disciple today, and yet he had pushed the time back 3 days. Could it be that he was hesitating? But no one dared to question the imperial advisor's decision. "Excellent. Your disciple will one day be at the top of the Dali dynasty. You should indeed take your time to choose," said Li Sun with a nod. "Thank you for coming here today, everyone. If you wish to stay here at Dali Academy as a guest, you may do so as you please," said the imperial advisor with a bow. Then he walked over to Li Sun and the others and said, "Your Highness, let's leave it here for today," said Li Sun with a bow. They said their farewells and dispersed. The people from Dali Mountain also gradually left, and the shadow-bearing sword saint walked over to Futian. "Elder," said Futian, bowing. "You won't go with me to Sword Mountain?" asked the shadow-bearing sword saint. "You said that if I won, I wouldn't have to go," said Futian. If he was cultivating at Sword Mountain, how could he kill Li Yao? It would be difficult to find a chance. He had to stay in Dali Imperial City. And given his performance today, someone would undoubtedly come to find him. "Fine," said the shadow-bearing sword saint with a nod. "It will be good for you to stay in the city and cultivate. You will certainly have a good future. Until we meet again." "Until we meet again," said Futian with a bow. The cultivators from Sword Mountain left. Jian Wu gave him a final look. "You're going to refuse him?" Li Yu asked Futian. Futian smiled and said, "Let's go." And on saying so, they left. The people who had attended the sparring session at Dali Academy quickly scattered throughout the city. Di Hao's fame was like the sun at noon. He had defeated Dong Chen and had earned the reputation of being the best cultivator under the saint level. And he had asked to be the imperial advisor's disciple. At the same time, Seven Swordsman's name was also resonating throughout the city. He had defeated Jian Wu of Sword Mountain. If it hadn't been for Di Hao, Seven Swordsman probably would have become the most shocking figure of the day. Many people were speculating about who the imperial advisor would choose as a disciple. Di Hao or Dong Chen. The 3 days passed in the blink of an eye, as many people kept speculating. On that day, Futian was cultivating as usual. It was just like he had said. All that was left before him was the divine path. "Is Master Seventh Swordsman here?" came a voice from outside his residence. Futian opened his eyes and said, "Who is it?" "The household of Marquis Qingyi has come to pay a visit," came the voice. It seemed to be someone whom the Dali dynasty had made a marquis. "Please come in,"
said Yi Futian.
A group of people walked in. They walked up towards him, and an old man at the front smiled and bowed to him. I am always hearing the name Seventh Swordsman. Your swordsmanship is unmatched. You are truly a dragon among men. He was extremely familiar and friendly. A maid came up behind him, holding a brocade box. It seemed that they had brought a gift. You are too kind, but to what do I owe the pleasure? Said Yi Futian with a bow. There was another extremely beautiful woman beside the old man. She was slim and graceful, fair and lovely. My daughter loves swordsmanship, and when she heard of you, she wanted to come see you. I'm sorry that we had to bother you, so we brought some gifts to congratulate you on your victory, said the old man with a smile. Yi Futian looked at the woman beside him and saw that the shy look in her eyes made her even more delicate and charming. Yi Futian was stunned. This was... With this kind of expression, how could Yi Futian not understand what his visitor meant? With this kind of expression, how could Yi Futian not understand what his visitor meant? It was just that he did not know why a marquis show him such goodwill. Where did his appreciation for him come from? The Shui family of Dali Imperial City has come to visit. Is Master Seventh Swordsman here? Came another voice from outside. Yi Futian was stunned, then said, Please come in. He then watched as another group of people walked into his residence. They came up to him and said, Congratulations, Master Seventh Swordsman. The household of Marquis Yang has come to greet you. The Lin family has come to greet you. Voice after voice came from outside. Yi Futian invited them all in one after the other, and in the blink of an eye his residence was full of people. And everyone who had come were people of status. Among them, many of the families had brought their family beauties along with them. All of them were lovely and elegant women, so beautiful as to make fish sink and birds alight. They were a feast for the eyes, and Yi Futian's eyes feasted on them, but it was all a little awkward. Could it be Master Seventh Swordsman? At that moment, another beautiful figure flashed over. Li Yu and Li Yang had come directly to him. They were familiar with each other, so they did not need to be announced. Greetings, my prince, princess. Everyone bowed when they saw them. Although King Li was the absolute master of the lower worlds, his influence was quite weak in the upper worlds. But he was after all one of the four kings. Yi Futian looked up at the two of them and saw that both of them looked rather excited. They descended before him, and Li took a step forward, coming right up to him. Master Seventh Swordsman, she said, there is news from the Imperial Advisor's household. He has chosen you. In her excitement, Li Yu was leaning very close to Yi Futian. He suddenly caught a whiff of the fragrance she was wearing. Seeming to see the strange look on Yi Futian's face, Li Yu suddenly realized how close the two of them were. She blushed and took a step back, but there was still excitement in her beautiful eyes. Everyone had thought that the person that the Imperial Advisor chose would be either Di Hao or Dong Qin, but new information had come from the Imperial Advisor's household. The Imperial Advisor of the Dali dynasty would take Seven Swordsmen as his disciple. Everyone had been waiting for news from the Imperial Advisor for the past few days, and once it came out they were instantly in motion. That was why they had all come here so fast, and why everything that had taken place here at his residence had happened. The greatest swordsman of his generation had been recognized by the Imperial Advisor and chosen to be his disciple. His future path was hard to predict. But at the very least they could come to get to know him and congratulate him. There was nothing wrong with maintaining friendly relations with him. And if Yi Futian noticed the beautiful women in their families, that was even better. Seven Swordsman was still young and extremely talented. His swordsmanship was unmatched, and he was also very handsome. This kind of man was extremely rare. The disciple of the Imperial Advisor could even seek to marry a princess, and Emperor Li would not refuse him. Given what had happened in his residence, Li Yu's news was not unexpected, nor did it surprise him too much. In reality, he did not want to become the Imperial Advisor's disciple. When the Imperial Advisor had questioned him on that day, he had felt a strong sense of pressure and alertness. And Xia Qingyuan had once reminded him that at the Imperial Advisor's side, he would be under even greater threat. Of course, his status would also be very high, and he could come into direct contact with Li Yao. What does that expression mean? Li Yu saw Yi Futian's aloof and unconcerned look and could not help but purse her lips. The imperial advisor had chosen him as his personal disciple, and he did not even look a little bit excited. Previously, the shadow-bearing sword saint had invited him to come to Sword Mountain to cultivate. But that was only Sword Mountain, and the master of Sword Mountain had not promised to take Yi Futian as a disciple. However, now the imperial advisor did want to take him as a disciple. The two things could not even be mentioned in the same sentence. And moreover, even the master of Sword Mountain was of lower status than the imperial advisor. He was lower only than Emperor Li himself. What expression should I have? Asked Yi Futian. Li Yu said nothing to him. Her excitement seemed to have been ruined by his cold blood, and she just stared at him. At that moment there was another voice from the sky, as another mighty group of figures came. They descended into his residence, and at their head was the imperial advisor's disciple Lu Chuan. Some of those who had come with him were members of the imperial family. For example, the prince of the Dali dynasty Li Yao was there as well. 7 swordsmen called Lu Chuan as he walked towards Yi Futian. My master is willing to take you as his disciple and would like to ask your opinion on the matter. Are you willing? Lu Chuan spoke directly and frankly. Yi Futian looked at everyone around him. With the imperial advisor's position within the Dali dynasty, he had even been able to send Li Yao as part of the group inviting Yi Futian. Under this situation, if he refused, he would have no chance to get close to the Dali dynasty. Li Yao would also get farther away. I am willing to enter the imperial advisor's household, said Yi Futian. Perhaps the threat was greater, but entering the imperial advisor's household to cultivate would bring him closer to Li Yao, and thus his chance of killing Li Yao would become greater. Li Yu let out a big breath when she heard Yi Futian's answer, as if she had finally relaxed. She had truly feared that Yi Futian might refuse. In the Dali dynasty, no one refused to enter the imperial advisor's household. Even Di Hao had requested to join him after defeating Dong Chen. But Li Yu could not get a handle on Yi Futian. The guy was a mystery. But now he had finally accepted. From now on you may call me brother, said Lu Chuan with a smile. Brother Lu Chuan, Yi Futian called out with a smile. He had stepped into his role quickly. Everyone in his residence bowed. Congratulations, 7th swordsman. From this day forward, there would be another hero in the Dali dynasty. 7th swordsman. At that moment, Li Yao walked forward as well and said, Congratulations. Greetings, your highness, said Yi Futian with a slight bow. No need to be so polite. I am also a disciple of the imperial advisor. I may not be personally taught by him, but from now on I will still call you brother. You can call me Li Yao or brother. Li Yao seemed very polite. Your highness, I wouldn't dare be so improper, said Yi Futian, taking a step away from him. Don't worry about it. You'll soon get used to it, said Li Yao with a smile. He seemed very easy to get along with. Seeing Li Yao's attitude, Yi Futian relaxed a little. This way, he would not have to fear not getting his chance. The danger was greater, but it seemed that it was worth it. If he entered the imperial advisor's household, he would have a chance to kill Li Yao in the future. Of course, at this point he could not reveal even a little bit of his hostility. Let us all go to the imperial advisor's residence together, said Lu Chuan. Yi Futian nodded, and the group of them left together. As they were leaving his residence, he saw several people appear there. In the distance there were people watching him, which made everyone stop. What are you doing, Li Xian? Said Li Yao. Li Xian bowed to Li Yao, then said, Your Highness, I only came to ask Mr. Lu Chuan, why did the imperial advisor choose 7 swordsmen? Does my master need to explain his choice of disciple to you? Asked Lu Chuan. How can I dare question his choice of disciple? It's just that several days ago this man held a sword to my throat, and now the imperial advisor has taken him as a disciple. I'm a little hurt by that, said Li Xian. So, said Lu Chuan. It's nothing. I'm just a little hurt by it, said Li Xian with a smile. Then he stepped back. Don't try to stir up trouble, said Li Yao to Li Xian. They all ignored Li Xian then, and looked ahead of them. Up there, A group of figures were standing proudly, with powerful auras. These were the cultivators of Daily Mountain, and the youth standing at their head was Di Hao. At that moment, countless people were already gathered in the area. After the news had come out from the Imperial Advisor's residence, the people had flowed here like water. The whole city had been shaken. The Imperial Advisor had not chosen Dong Chun of Dali Academy, nor had he chosen Di Hao, the most powerful figure under the Saint level. Instead, he had chosen 7 swordsmen. No one knew what the Imperial Advisor was thinking, and they were all curious. They did not know why the Imperial Advisor had done this, and at the same time they wanted to see what kind of person 7 swordsman was. Now they saw that he was incredibly handsome and extremely heroic-looking. But now, Di Hao, who had defeated Dong Chen and claimed the title of the most powerful person below the Saint level, was there, standing in front of Futian. The Imperial Advisor did not choose the defeated Dong Chen, but he also did not choose Brother Di Hao. Was it because he comes from Daily Mountain? Is that why he chose him? The 7 sins stood beside Di Hao with sharp eyes as they stared at Futian. My master had his own reasons for making his choice. Does he have to explain them to you? Lu Chuan frowned. This was the second time he had been questioned, and so his tone was a bit colder. No matter if they were from the Prince Regent's household or Daily Mountain, they had no right to question the Imperial Advisor's decisions, especially not who he chose as a disciple. Do not be so rash, 7 sins, said Di Hao. The 7 sins' eyes were sharp, and sword were wrapped around them as they stared forward. Di Hao took a few steps forward and said, since the Imperial Advisor has made his choice, there is nothing that I can say. Today I am returning to Daily Mountain to cultivate. Before that, I would like to teach the Imperial Advisor's chosen disciple a lesson. Sword will swirled around him, and his majestic aura swept out. He stared straight ahead at Futian and said, I am Di Hao of Daily Mountain. Show me what you've got. As he said this, the hubbub around them subsided, and all was silent. Di Hao was arrogant without question. He had no right to question the Imperial Advisor's decision, but before he left the city, he would stand before the one the Imperial Advisor had chosen to be his disciple. At least he would leave something behind before he left. Countless gazes fell upon Futian. Did he dare to accept the challenge? 3 days ago, Di Hao had defeated Dong Chen. Everyone thought that Daily Mountain meant to shame the Imperial Advisor, but afterwards Di Hao had asked to become the Imperial Advisor's disciple. But now it was different. The Imperial Advisor had chosen 7th swordsman. If Di Hao defeated him, or even crushed him absolutely, that would probably be quite embarrassing for the Imperial Advisor. This Di Hao had some anger in his heart. That was why he had come here to stand before Futian. Di Hao was no the only one who was angry. All of the people from Daily Mountain were. If the Imperial Advisor had chosen Dong Chen as his disciple, even though Di Hao had defeated him, they could still accept this. After all, Dong Chen was the Imperial Advisor's man. Di Hao would have left quietly. But the Imperial Advisor had chosen 7th swordsman. Futian looked at Di Hao and was silent for a moment. Then he stepped forward and said, I am 7th swordsman. Show me what you've got. Futian's body had soared while circling him as soon as he finished talking. He turned his eyes at Di Hao, looking calm and without a hint of irritation. Futian's body had soared while circling him as soon as he finished talking. He turned his eyes at Di Hao, looking calm and without a hint of irritation. So the students of Daily Mountain are unable to sit well with the Imperial Advisor taking me in as a student. Futian thought. Well then, we'll have to fight it out. A bolt of lightning streaked through the air. Futian shot to the sky like a sword. It was not Dali Academy and there was no battle platform. As such, there was no need for restraints, and one could have fought in the sky to their heart's content. There was not even any need to suppress one's power. Di Hao looked up slightly after seeing what Futian was doing. He stepped out and took to the air as well. The sound of the bell resounded with a big dong, shaking the eardrums of those below. Yi Futian felt his brain being shaken. A formless sound wave swept past and invaded his spiritual will right away. It was an overpowering move that caused his mind to be rattled. It was a sound wave attack of the Great Path, one which had no form. Yi Futian did not stop but continued flying upwards instead, shooting into the clouds. Di Hao pursued him, and both of them were flying at blitzing speeds. All three of Di Hao's life spirits, the sword, the cauldron, and the bell, appeared. Super powerful will of the Great Path swept through the air. He stepped in midair, and the sound of the bell resounded throughout the sky, covering all of their surroundings. Formless ancient bells appeared around Yi Futian and bombarded him with the undying sound of the bell. Yi Futian's pupils turned extremely demonic. It was as if his eyes were able to see through everything. The formless bells were unable to escape his eyes. A sword appeared in his hand, and lightning storms rained down from above, which were fused with his sword like the calamity of the world. Attack! Yi Futian lashed out with his sword.
Dong.
The sound of the bells rang throughout the air as the bells exploded and crumbled one after another.
Boom.
The cauldron behind Di Hao grew in a frenzy to hundreds of meters tall, raining down, suppressing the will of the Great Path. Their surroundings resonated with his power as one cauldron after another came into being, sealing the space that Yi Futian occupied right away. Extremely dazzling light was seen coursing all over Yi Futian's body. Sword aura howled and circled about him. One heavy sword after another appeared, and every single one of them emanated terrifying power. The sword spirit appeared before him dazzlingly. He held it with both hands, and boundless sword will float about, fusing into the sword spirit and transforming it into a 100-meter-tall sword that weighed thousands of pounds. Down, Di Hao said coldly. The cauldrons dived and pressed onto Yi Futian like the might of the heavens. Yi Futian burst with sword will, and the heavy sword shot up to the sky, clashing with the cauldrons. Loud rumbling noises that shook the heavens were heard. Di Hao stepped out, and the bells rang in unison. That cauldron shot up and came right above Yi Futian. Boundless light of the Great Path rained down on Yi Futian. Countless shadows of the cauldron came down as well, making the space stifling. Yi Futian swung his hand about, and the heavy swords hovered in midair, letting out high-pitched ringing sounds. He shot out with his hand and clapped on the heavy sword. One shadow of the heavy sword after another shot up, clashing with the cauldrons that were raining down. At the same time, Yi Futian pushed the heavy sword while he streaked forward, mowing down everything that was standing in his way. The 100-meter-tall gigantic sword pressed forward with immense might, bombarding the cauldron's spirit. It burst with extremely dazzling glimmer as devastating might of the Great Path washed all over the sky. Di Hao looked at the one who attacked his cauldron spirit with a sword and continued to move forward. Sword will howled behind him, and the swords of Cassiopeia coalesced, pulsing with light out to tear everything apart. The swords rang loudly as they were being pointed at Yi Futian. Yi Futian stepped out, and the air trembled. His aura was towering as he clapped the gigantic sword before him. Power from within his body burst, and the cauldron spirit was thrown far away with a loud boom. Go! Di Hao uttered a single word. The swords of Cassiopeia shot through the skies as they spun, tearing through the space at great speed, arriving right before his opponent. Yi Futian stepped into the air at almost the same moment, throwing out his sword right before him. A terrifying screen appeared in front of that heavy sword in an instant, ramming straight at the sword of Cassiopeia, but unable to penetrate it. The light of stars dazzled on the screen, protecting Yi Futian behind it. Di Hao's expression was cold. He stepped once again, pointing with his finger, coalescing even more swords forward. The cauldron in the air was dropped yet again. Yi Futian did not bother with that falling cauldron. He stepped forward once again, wrapping up the swords of Cassiopeia as he pressed on. His power of the swords becoming even more frightening as he streaked through the air. Boundless light of the sword from Yi Futian flowed into that gigantic sword before him. He eventually slapped with both of his hands, and with a loud boom, The gigantic sword shattered the swords of Cassiopeia, ramming ahead straight at Di Hao. Di Hao shot up and evaded the attack in an instant, but Yi Futian did not bother with it. He stepped forward and held the sword with both hands, flipping his entire body behind. He gathered overwhelming strength and swung the sword out with massive force. He melded extremely overbearing power from his whole being into that chop within that very instant. The enormous golden cauldron spirit came at him again as the heavy sword was swung.
Clang.
A terrifying rumble was heard, and the cauldron spirit rattled violently. Di Hao grunted midair. He extended his hand and summoned the cauldron back to the air. Yi Futian stepped forward and spun, throwing out another chop with the heavy sword.
Clang.
Yet another rumble was heard as the cauldron spirit was pinned down. Its sound resounded throughout the space as it kept rattling. Di Hao's face was rather ashen. That was his life spirit. Furthermore, the power of the sword around Yi Futian was still growing. Sword will continued to course about Di Hao's body. The sword of Cassiopeia was circling around him before shooting down through the air, heading straight for Yi Futian. Yi Futian stepped around in the air and brought his sword down again. So long Di Hao refused to come down, Yi Futian would make do with pummeling his life spirits. Di Hao descended. Endless killing swords shot through the air, intending to kill Yi Futian. However, when Yi Futian brought his heavy sword down, the entire space seemed to have been placed in a lockdown. That sword is not sharp at all, but it brought with it boundless heft.
Boom.
Despite his formidable powers, Di Hao was thrown off by the attack. The swords of raging storms manifested around Yi Futian and flew straight at Di Hao, who looked troubled as he pointed forward, sword spirit in hand, intending to mow everything down. At that moment, Yi Futian streaked through the air and brought the heavy sword down from above. Di Hao disappeared from where he stood, turning into a beam of dazzling light. However, Yi Futian disappeared alongside him after having him targeted. That sword attack moved along the space with Yi Futian, heading straight for Di Hao, just like that attack that he swung at Seven Sins 3 days ago, ignoring the movements in space altogether. Di Hao was brought down by the attack from above. His body dropped to the ground in a straight line. Yi Futian did not stop right there. He took one step and dove down. However, the heavy sword in his hand transformed in a heartbeat, dispersing into a sword filled with the will of the great path of space. It followed Yi Futian down. He launched yet another attack at Di Hao, tearing through the space as he went. Countless people from below looked up. They were only able to see countless beams of the sword flashing where Yi Futian was, shooting in different directions. It seemed as if there were nothing but the aura of the sword in that space. A beam of the sword flashed as it dived, making it seem as if the space was being bisected. It was as if the place was being cut down by the heavens. At the very next moment, a beam of light shot down, and with a loud boom, 2 silhouettes were found on the ground, bursting with sword aura. Everyone turned their eyes in that direction. Sword will fill that space and rang. When the sword aura was dispersed, 2 silhouettes were seen. Di Hao and Yi Futian appeared clearly. In that instant, the place was dead silent without a hint of sound, other than the reverberation from wind and sword while howling. The hearts of many seemed to have stopped, and the mighty ones were ashen as they stared at the scene before them. How is this possible? The tip of Yi Futian's sword was pointed at Di Hao's throat. Di Hao's clothing was in a mess after being torn apart by the sword aura. 7th Swordsman. The faces of the spectators were filled with fright and awe. He had defeated Di Hao with his swords. The 7th Swordsman had defeated Jian Wu of the Sword Mountain 3 days ago, making his name known throughout Emperor Li's city. However, Di Hao had defeated Dong Chen and became known as the most powerful person below St. Plain in all of Dali. Yet, the imperial advisor chose the 7th Swordsman to become his student instead. As such, Di Hao came there. No one expected Di Hao, who had defeated Dong Chen and was known to be at the pinnacle below St. Plain in all of Dali, was defeated by the 7th Swordsman. Everything looked surreal. That is something. Li Yao, Lu Chuan, and the others were rather impressed. When the seven swordsmen had defeated Jian Wu and became known as the #1 swordsman below St. Plain, he did not make any other moves after that. No one would have expected that he was more powerful than Di Hao. As for Li Yu, she was already gasping. Her eyes were locked onto seventh swordsman, and she was utterly speechless. That swordsman from the lower worlds remained peerless even in the upper worlds. None below St. Plain in all of Dali dynasty was able to win against his swords. You have a problem? Yi Futian asked, his eyes locked onto Di Hao. The imperial advisor decided to take Yi Futian as a student, and Di Hao showed up to provoke Yi Futian. What do you mean by this? He thought. You think I don't deserve that? How about now? Do you have a problem? Di Hao was speechless. Losers had no right to speak. He had defeated the most powerful student of the Dali Academy, Dong Chen. He did not pay the seven swordsmen any heed even when Yi Futian defeated the seven sins that day, as his target was Dong Chen alone. No one would have expected that after defeating Dong Chen, he, who was lauded as invincible below St. Plain, would have ended up being defeated by the seven swordsmen. The seventh swordsman did not belong to any force before, even he was chosen by the imperial advisor. So the imperial advisor's eyes were really that sharp, then? #1 below St. Plain in all of Dali dynasty, huh? You should take my swords into consideration before claiming to be that, Yi Futian said, and sheathed his sword. He let go of Di Hao and stepped back, before saying to Lu Chuan and the others, let's go. Lu Chuan nodded and walked with Yi Futian, passing by Di Hao. Di Hao remained standing where he was, as did those from Daily Mountain. All of them were speechless. Countless watched Yi Futian and his party leave. Their hearts were still racing from the stunning scenes they witnessed. No one would have expected that the title of #1 below St. Plain in all of Dali dynasty had shifted to someone else so quickly. The seven swordsmen would come to be renowned throughout the world as the personal student of the imperial advisor and the #1 below St. Plain in all of Dali dynasty. His future became something foreseeable. No one would dare doubt how the imperial advisor chose his students. Many were impressed and came to wonder if the imperial advisor had long known that the seventh swordsman was capable of beating Di Hao. Yi Futian initially thought that the imperial advisor's residence would have been extremely magnificent and grand, due to its status as the residence of all who stood at such high positions in the Dali dynasty. Yi Futian initially thought that the imperial advisor's residence would have been extremely magnificent and grand, due to its status as the residence of all who stood at such high positions in the Dali dynasty. However, when he arrived outside the place, what he saw was but a rather common manor, which was in no way magnificent nor grand. Seeing Yi Futian stopping, Lu Chuan asked, surprised? Rather surprising indeed, Yi Futian said. The value of a mountain is judged not by its height, Lu Chuan said nonchalantly. The title of imperial advisor's residence was more than enough. Yi Futian nodded and followed Lu Chuan into the place. Everyone else who were there to send them on the trip, including Li Yao and Li Yu, have left. The imperial advisor's residence was a private residence of the imperial advisor, with several personal students of his living within. While the place was not huge, but it was quaint and elegant nonetheless. The towers were placed in an artful manner. When Yi Futian saw the imperial advisor again, he found the elder standing before a tower. That place felt clean and simple to Yi Futian. Teacher, Lu Chuan called as he bowed.
Yeah?
The imperial advisor nodded and turned his eyes at Yi Futian. Yi Futian bowed and said, the seventh swordsman hereby greets you. Teacher, I don't have much of any rules around here. There is no need to be bound by mundane propriety. Do you find it surprising that I have chosen you to be my student this time? The imperial advisor asked Yi Futian. I'm rather surprised indeed. The seventh swordsman nodded. The people of Dali all thought that you would have either picked Di Hao or Dong Chen. Why did not pick me instead? He had indeed wanted to know why the imperial advisor picked him. The Dali Academy holds a forum every year to either discuss battle or the way of cultivation. After the battle between Di Hao and Dong Chen, I have asked all three of you about why did you seek the way, the imperial advisor spoke. Yi Futian nodded. He looked rather nervous back then. At that moment, after entering the Imperial Advisor's residence, he actually became more relaxed. He reminded himself to be conscious of his current identity, the Seventh Swordsman, and forget about being Yi Futian. He did not bring his enmity and vengeance with him, as it would have exposed him instead. He was already mentally prepared to play his character well when he was on the way to the Imperial Advisor's residence. Dong Chun and Di Hao answered in a similar manner. Both of them claimed to do so for Dolly, but you sought the way more for yourself. People learn to love themselves before they learn to love others. I find that very agreeable. Faith is not something as simple as people often put it to be. When a person becomes cornered and forced to choose, faith would crumble all the same, the Imperial Advisor elaborated. But that shouldn't have sufficed to have you pick me as your student, Yi Futian added. Of course. The Imperial Advisor nodded and continued. What truly cemented my decision was the line behind. The great path knows no boundaries. People learn to love themselves before they could love others. People learn to be independent before they could be of aid to others. All of that coupled with the line, the great path knows no boundaries, would have sufficed, the Imperial Advisor said. Yi Futian looked at the middle-aged man. He never once thought that what cemented the Imperial Advisor's decision would have been his words back in the Dali Academy. You spoke of selfishness with the lines before and altruism with the lines after. As such, I came to believe that if you were to become able to be independent, you would then be able to put the way that you believe in into action. The great path knows no boundaries. Yi Futian was very startled to find that the Imperial Advisor actually came to admire that line. When the Imperial Advisor pinned him down with great pressure, he was unable to lie, and he did not want to. He never considered becoming a student of the Imperial Advisor in the first place, so he answered according to what he desired instead. However, the notion of the great path knows no boundaries was apparently different from what Emperor Li's realm adhered to. The Crown Prince, Li Sun, said immediately after that, claiming that the world was filled with boundaries. Emperor Li's realm, Emperor Xia's realm, and whatnot, all of those were boundaries, and he questioned how could the great path be of no boundaries. The Battle of Empty Realm was an excellent example, as it was a culmination of the conflict between the three imperial realms. His impression of the Imperial Advisor of Dali had been that of a great pillar who devoted his being to make Dali dynasty strong, whose pressure overwhelmed all. He was unable to understand why someone like that would have agreed to that notion. He was indeed puzzled. How about you? I have heard that you have refused the offer to join the Sword Mountain. What changed your mind about taking up my offer? The Imperial Advisor asked. You are one who stands at the pinnacle of Emperor Li's realm, and you are known as the number one below His Majesty, teacher. How could I have refused? Yi Futian continued. Furthermore, if I were to refuse, would there be a place in Dali dynasty then? Would Li Xian come to be up to no good with me instead? If he were to refuse, none of those top-notch figures would have dared to get close to him. If the Imperial Advisor had not extended his invitation, there would not have been any problems, as he could have simply took other paths. You are indeed practical. So, that is to say that you don't actually want all that much to study under me then? You would have straight up challenged Di Hao otherwise. It was apparent that the Imperial Advisor knew that he had defeated Di Hao. Di Hao was powerful, comprehensively speaking, but his way of the sword might not have been more powerful than Jianwu. I have already defeated Jianwu, so I saw no reason to fight any further. And furthermore, it was like you put it, I haven't thought of studying under you before. To me, training could be carried out anywhere. Yi Futian was honest with his words. None of what he said, right, there had been lies. You are indeed prideful. The Imperial Advisor smiled and said, You are now a student of mine. What do you wish to learn from me then? Yi Futian looked up with pondering eyes. He was already half a saint at that moment, and was indeed one step away from becoming a saint. What he lacked was comprehension of the world and the right state of mind. Powerful figures would have been of little help in teaching him more. The only way forward with his training rested on him, and him alone. I'd like to read the literary collections of the Sword of Dali, Yi Futian said. All right, the imperial advisor did not hesitate, nodding in agreement to his request, and said, you shall head to the library of Dali Academy together with your elder brother. There are countless books on cultivation in all of Dali, so there is naturally no lack of books on swords. Browse to your heart's contents. Furthermore, since you're versed in multiple types of will of the Great Path, you could learn from the different types of methods stored there and incorporate them in your way of the sword. I understand. Yi Futian stood and bowed. There should have been many top-notch training methods found within the library of Dali Academy. Pay a visit to your elder brothers while you're on your way to the Dali Academy, the imperial advisor said again. Will do? Yi Futian nodded again. The imperial advisor was the chief of Dali Academy, so it was only natural for his students to all be studying in Dali Academy. Furthermore, all of them had been from Dali Academy to begin with only Yi Futian being the exception. That was probably why everyone in Dali thought the imperial advisor would have taken Dong Chun as his student instead. You're dismissed. Lu Chuan would take you to your quarters. The imperial advisor said nothing else. Yes, teacher. Lu Chuan and Yi Futian left together. Lu Chuan arranged for a place for Yi Futian to stay in the imperial advisor's residence, which was in a quiet tower. Brother. Lu Chuan took out a storage ring and handed it to Yi Futian. What is this? Yi Futian asked. Some fragments of the ways of the sword, covering all attributes. While they might not be much, but you'd be able to train for quite some time with them to further your sword training, Lu Chuan smiled and said. I can't take this, Yi Futian said. This is a gift from teacher, Lu Chuan said. Yi Futian only stopped refusing and took it over. Rest earlier today. We'd head to Dali Academy tomorrow. Despite being a student of the teacher here in Imperial Advisor's residence, there is no need for you to attend to anything special. So you could just train here in peace and try to break into St. Plain as soon as possible, Lu Chuan said with a smile. Yeah? Yi Futian nodded and said, Thank you, senior. This is nothing. Lu Chuan then added, a younger brother used to live here, and there are some things of his still around. No need to mind them. Why would you let me stay here then? Yi Futian able to somehow speculate something was going on, so he asked. He died in battle. Lu Chuan sighed. Yi Futian was able to feel Lu Chuan's dejection and said, I'm sorry. He had not joined us for long, and should have had a bright future ahead of him. Lu Chuan shook his head and left. We'll get the score settled at a later date. He left after he was done talking. Yi Futian did not know what to think. Yuan Jin died by his hands after all. At that moment, he was arranged to stay in a place that Yuan Jin used to stay in. The imperial advisor and Lu Chuan. Yi Futian mumbled to himself. The imperial advisor agreed to the notion of the Great Path, knowing no boundaries. He was still unable to fathom why, but he deemed that he would have understood given time. He sat cross-legged before the tower and closed his eyes to train, finding his mind in turmoil. He had used extremely little time to get to the heart of Dali, and even get in contact with Li Yao directly. If he were to have no sense of preservation, he could have killed Li Yao right there and then. With his current identity, it became convenient for him to get in contact with Li Yao directly. Killing him became very easy. The problem, however, was how to escape in one piece after he was done. Yi Futian spent the day thinking, finding himself unable to quiet down. Dali Imperial City was just as restless as he was. The case with the imperial advisor taking in a student and the battle between the seventh swordsman and Di Hao became the talk of the town. There was simply no one who had not heard of the seventh swordsman by then. Lu Chuan returned to the imperial advisor, and he was seen sitting on the floor, training. The imperial advisor asked after seeing Lu Chuan show up, What is the problem, Lu Chuan? Teacher, the battle between little brother and Di Hao was a showcase of his immense combat capacity. Even I had gotten surprised, Lu Chuan said. What are you getting at? The imperial advisor asked. Is there a need to check things out in the lower worlds, teacher? Lu Chuan asked. There is no need for that. The imperial advisor then said, Remember, Lu Chuan. When I chose to make him a student of mine, he then became your little brother in training. Be it his past or future, there is no need to be bothered about it. I understand. Lu Chuan bowed and left, putting the matter aside. Even if he were to venture down to the lower worlds, he would not have been able to find out anything. There was simply no way to investigate a person that just appeared out of nowhere, as there were no leads to trace. The Imperial Advisor looked up at the sky after Lu Chuan left. The stars were all over the night sky. His eyes were incredibly deep, as if he was able to pierce through the void above and see how the stars move. In Emperor Xia's palace, after Xia Qingyuan knew that Yi Futian was taken into the Imperial Advisor's residence to study under the Imperial Advisor, the sacred beat gave the black-winged condor another round of beating. The black-winged condor was in tears, swearing that it would not be called a qualified bird if it were to not get back to the one who gave it a good beating. Yi Futian had been away from Emperor Xia's realm for quite a while. A lot had happened since, but Yi Futian was without a doubt nowhere to be seen. Yi Futian had been away from Emperor Xia's realm for quite a while. A lot had happened since, but Yi Futian was without a doubt nowhere to be seen. In a compound found within the Shao clan's manor in Emperor Xia's realm, Shao Sheng was coming to meet his father, Shao Qianhe. Shao Sheng had been forbidden from stepping foot into Emperor Xia's palace since the end of the Battle of Empty Realm. This essentially meant that he was completely cut off from the center of power of Emperor Xia's realm for good. His status with the Shao clan had plunged since then, as he was no longer nurtured to be the next leader of the clan. Shao Sheng experienced every bit of that difference in how his clansmen treated him, but he dedicated his efforts even more into his training to try to break through the obstacles posed by the plains. He would finally break into Saint Plain to prove his worth to those of the Shao clan. He planned to venture out on a pilgrimage as soon as he stepped into Saint Plain. However, despite having become half a saint by then, he was still unable to communicate with the great path of the world and become a saint. He came to Shao Qinhe, his father's place on that day. "Father," Shao Sheng bowed and called out. Shao Qianhe looked up at Shao Sheng and sighed deep down. Shao Sheng was the most gifted among his children. "Why haven't you gone to train in isolation?" Shao Qianhe asked. "I heard that the people of the Divine Cloud Valley are here. Are they here for the matter with Gongsun and I?" Shao Sheng asked. Shao Qianhe took a look at him and nodded. "The incident you kicked up was the talk of the town, and given how you've been mesmerized by a woman into doing what you were doing, the people of Divine Cloud Valley considered it best to avoid the matter between you and Gongsun and I." Shao Sheng said nothing. He did not show any signs of hatred or anger on his face. He had long expected that things would have ended up as such. Both parties had thoughts about a marriage alliance, and they had discussed it before. But how things were at the moment, there was simply no way the Divine Cloud Valley would allow Gongsun and I to marry him. A lot has been going on in Emperor Xia's realm as of late, but Yi Futian is nowhere to be found. It's been said that even when the Divine Cloud Valley was crafting implements for the people of the 9 states, Yi Futian still didn't show up. Many claimed that he was training in isolation to break into Saint Plain. "I wonder if Yi Futian has been training in the Golden Hall of the Lotus in the royal palace all this while," Shao Sheng said. Yi Futian was allowed free access to Emperor Xia's palace to train. He was even permitted to enter the Golden Hall of the Lotus, and that had been a compromise Shao Sheng's aunt, Queen Shao, made for his sake. Shao Sheng, on the other hand, was practically in a ditch at the moment. The difference between the two men was very apparent. "Maybe," Shao Kaine answered. "Why would the princess summon Yi Futian's demonic beast into the royal palace then? I have heard that the beast never left the royal palace since then. Is the beast training in the Golden Hall of the Lotus, just like Yi Futian?" Shao Sheng asked. Shao Qianhe turned to look at his son as Shao Sheng spoke. It seemed that even while he was training, Shao Sheng paid close attention to Yi Futian's whereabouts, so much so that he had also paid attention to his demonic beast. "Some enmity you have there." "Indeed," Shao Qianhe thought. "What are you getting at?" Shao Qianhe asked. Yi Futian demonstrated his ability to enthrall demonic beasts in the Battle of Empty Realm. He was even able to control them remotely and did not need to be by their side. That black-winged condor steed of his was even able to receive his commands from far away. Father, I'm wondering if that beast is training in the Golden Hall of the Lotus, or if it simply is still in the princess residence, Xiaosheng said. Seems you've come to your conclusions. But even if the bird is indeed at the princess place, what do you think that means? That Yi Futian is there as well? Xiao Qianhe then continued, even if Xia Qingyuan has indeed let him stay at her place, it's still none of your business, given how even His Majesty is not bothered. His voice turned slightly serious. Despite feeling displeased with what had taken place, the incident was a lesson. Some matters were better left alone, regardless of how annoyed he was about them. Despite being her uncle, it was not Xiao Qianhe's place to butt into the princess business. No, Xiaosheng shook his head. You should know well about the princess personality, father. He might not be at her place. If the princess kept the bird at her place, it would naturally be for communication. That leads to the speculation if Yi Futian is even in the royal palace. Hell, for we all know, he might not even be in Emperor Xia's realm at the moment. Xiao Qianhe stared at Xiaosheng. There was no doubt that vengeance would have served as good motivation at times. Due to harboring intense enmity towards Yi Futian, Xiaosheng had been paying close attention to Yi Futian's whereabouts, and he came to an extremely accurate conclusion. What are you saying then? Xiao Qianhe asked while looking at his son. Even if Yi Futian is absent, there is still no need for the princess to keep his demonic beast. There is one other reason to be concerned. Xiaosheng's expression became sharp. Yi Futian is now somewhere very dangerous, and that is why the princess needs to monitor him at all times. Father, where do you think he ended up? You'd better keep the lesson from what happened last time, Xiao Qianhe warned him. He felt that his son was about to do something perilous. Rest assured, father. I've naturally learned my lesson. Xiaosheng nodded and said, I'll head back, father. He excused himself and left. Xiao Qianhe stared at his back as he went. The old man was thinking, where is Yi Futian? Xiaosheng's expression looked unusually cold when he turned around. Some speculations could have been easily verified. Despite being gone for quite a while, there were still quite a number of the people from the 9 states staying around. Xiaosheng wanted to know if Yi Futian was still in Emperor Xia's realm. If he was not, then when would he return? Yi Futian came to Dali Academy once again, with Lu Chuan by his side. Many surrounded them when he stepped into the Dali Academy. The battle between the 7 swordsmen and Di Hao proved that he was the #1 below Saint Plain in all of Dali dynasty, and that he was stronger than Dong Chen. That, coupled with the fact that he became a student of the Imperial Advisor, naturally earned him a lot of attention. Many whispered among themselves when he walked inside the Dali Academy. Yi Futian paid no heed to those voices and followed Lu Chuan to a place of training. There were already several people waiting for them. It was evident that they knew Yi Futian was coming. The oldest student of the Imperial Advisor, Yan Yuan, was there. Other than Yan Yuan, 3 others emanated extraordinary bearing. Greetings, elder brothers, Yi Futian called. He knew that those men were the students of the Imperial Advisor. I suppose you know our eldest brother here. The one at the side is our second brother, Nanzhai. Third brother, Mu Chunyang. Fourth brother, Wang Zhong. Lu Chuan introduced them one by one to Yi Futian. Lu Chuan was the 5th and Yuan Jin was the youngest, but at that moment it was Yi Futian. Our little brother here is indeed handsome. I'm sure girls will like you very much. Nanzhai, their second brother, smiled and said. What Yi Futian found peculiar was that Nanzhai was different from the other students of the Imperial Advisor. He was of very advanced age and sported silver hair and a beard, looking even older than the Imperial Advisor himself. His eyes were not large, and they turned to slits when he smiled, looking very amicable. In comparison, their third brother, Mu Chunyang, emanated a far sharper aura. He had shoulder-length black hair and wore black clothing. He wore a curved blade on his back, making it apparent that he was a blade wielder. Their fourth brother, Wang Zhong, looked extremely sharp in the eyes, which shimmered with golden light. He seemed very young, almost the same age as Yi Futian, but his real age was not so. Wang Zhong was a saint of true self at the second level of Saint Plane. In truth, Lu Chuan had introduced him to them before they came. All 5 personal students of the Imperial Advisor were very powerful. Their eldest brother, Yan Yuan, and their third brother, Mu Chunyang, were both unblemished saints at the third level of Saint Plane. Nanjai, who was the second brother, was inferior to the third in terms of plane level, as he was only a saint of true self. However, since he became the student of the Imperial Advisor at an earlier date, he became the second. Wang Zhong and Nanjai were of the same plane, that of saint of true self. Lu Chuan was at the first level of Saint Plane, that of the Doctrine Saint. He was already at the pinnacle and would break into true self at any given moment. With Yuan Jin dead, the Imperial Advisor came only to have 5 students left. Even Lu Chuan, who was the weakest among them, had been someone whose name was the talk of Dali Dynasty 10 years ago. One could have only imagined how prestigious being students of the Imperial Advisor were. It was due to such prestige that Di Hao wanted to study under the Imperial Advisor. After the Imperial Advisor chose Yi Futian instead, all of Dali Imperial City was shaken. "Brothers, I seek only the way of the sword and have little interest in affairs with girls," Yi Futian replied. It was rumored that Nanjai was of average talent, but he had a good state of mind. Despite being surpassed by Mu Chunyang, who had joined at a far later date than he, the incident became the talk of many. He remained unfettered and did not take it to heart. He was then 1 plane below his younger brother, Mu Chunyang. "It is good that you devote yourself to your seeking of the path, unlike your senior here, who gets distracted all the time and is now even surpassed by your third brother. Both you and Lu Chuan better not get too far with your training just yet. Remember to wait until your second brother here makes a breakthrough," Nanjai smiled and said. Yi Futian felt somewhat speechless at his words. Was this how a big brother should behave? Don't listen to his crap. If you run into any problem with your training in the future, seek out our teacher. If that doesn't prove possible, you could ask second brother here, Mu Chunyang said. It would seem like the third brother still has a lot of trust in me still, Nanjai nodded and quipped. You may not have much talent when it comes to training, but you are still an expert on empty talk. After all, Mu Chunyang replied. Cough, cough, Nanjai blushed and glared at Mu Chunyang. Leave some face for your elder brother, will you? I should go. Wang Zhong excused himself and left on his own. Yi Futian took one look at him, and Nanjai said, That's fourth brother for you. Don't mind him. Yeah. Yi Futian nodded. He had always felt saints to be on pedestals when he was still at lower planes as if they were unreachable beings. However, when his plane level had gotten close, he quickly found out that other than being of different states of mind due to being on higher planes, there was not that much of a difference when it came to daily interactions. Saints and sages were, but plane levels. They were still people. 7 Swordsman. Yan Yuan said, if you run into any problems in training and you need answers, come to second brother. If you'd like to temper your body with the power of the saint, come to the third brother. Should you have any problems with mundane matters, feel free to look for Lu Chuan. If none of them can help solve your problem, come to me. I understand. Yi Futian nodded. Regardless of how exceptional and legendary Lu Chuan was, he was still the youngest among his fellow students. It reminded Yi Futian of the cottage. Regardless of how exceptionally talented he was the youngest brother. While his elder brothers and sisters cared for him a lot, they still liked to tease him when nothing was going on nonetheless. He had never expected to find a sense of familiarity in Dali. He did not know what to think of it. Thank you, brother, for helping me get out of the mess outside of the Dali Academy that day, Yi Futian said. He was naturally referring to the matter with Li Xian. Yan Yuan seemed neutral back then, but he was actually leaning against Li Xian to have him make compromises when Yan Yuan offered to help. Li Xian had ulterior motives, and I wasn't doing that for you. If he continues to harass you in the future, there will be no need for you to go easy on him. Just be mindful not to kill him, Yan Yuan said plainly. Understood. Yi Futian nodded and left, heading towards the library of the Dali Academy. The library of Dali Academy was one of the wealthiest places in all of Dali Dynasty in terms of the variety of books available. One could even say that if there was something more precious other than the palace of Dali Imperial City, it was the books stored in the library of Dali Academy. The library of Dali Academy was one of the wealthiest places in all of Dali Dynasty in terms of the variety of books available. One could even say that if there was something more precious other than the palace of Dali Imperial City, it was the books stored in the library of Dali Academy. Dali Dynasty was a royal force, and many of the most powerful books and records regarding the most powerful cultivation methods available were all found within the palace. Dali Academy earned the support of Emperor Li back then when the place was established all those years ago. As such, many of the books found within the library were copied from the ones in Emperor Li's palace. As the place had gotten increasingly established, the library of the Dali Academy had become something like a holy land among holy lands. Powerful books on cultivation were available in untold numbers to the students of Dali Academy for furthering their training. But then again, all students of Dali Academy couldn't have access to all of the books found within the library. Every single cultivator found in Dali Academy had a different level of clearance, and the forum event held every year at Dali Academy held the key to such clearance. However, Futian skipped all of that and gained the highest level of clearance due to being a personal student of the Imperial Advisor. This allowed him access to any cultivation method found within the library. If the Imperial Advisor was to be said to be the supreme figure under Emperor Li in Emperor Li City, then the statuses of the Imperial Advisor's personal students were about just below that of the princes and princesses. Even the descendants of the fourth prince dared not claim they had higher prestige than the students of the Imperial Advisor, unless there were some exceptional figures on par with the students. Li Xian was a descendant of the Prince Regent, one of those from the third generation of the Prince Regent's residence. If he were to be compared with Lu Chuan or any of the Imperial Advisor students, no one would have taken Li Xian's status to be on par with that of Lu Chuan and the others. Many were descended from the princes, yet there were only 6 students who studied directly under the Imperial Advisor. Due to the need for separating the level of clearance between the students, the library of the Dali Academy was divided into 18 floors, and the building looked magnificent. When Futian came to the library, there were many students of the Dali Academy found there who were either found browsing the books on the racks or flipping through them on the benches. 7th Swordsman. Someone quickly took notice of Futian. More and more people lifted their heads to look at him with sparkling eyes. The 7th Swordsman was then the number 1 below St. Plain in Dali Imperial City. 7th Swordsman. How powerful was Di Hao? A beautiful female student asked with a smile. Futian glanced at her and walked away without replying. The place was in an uproar right there, and then many whispered and mumbled among themselves, finding him to be just as flippant and arrogant as he was rumored to be. However, none of them felt that there was anything wrong with him. He was the number 1 below St. Plain in Dali Dynasty after all, so it was only natural that he had the right to be arrogant. That was the 7th Swordsman they knew. Aloof, indeed. The woman who was ignored smiled and did not take his response to heart, thinking that he was extremely handsome and that his eyes seemed to be able to enchant people. He was indeed one of a kind among geniuses. Futian went directly to some of the upper floors in the library, browsing through a good number of books on swordsmanship and then some other methods of training as well. The very reason why he chose to come to the library first was so that he was able to train in more powers, which he would then incorporate within his way of the sword, developing sword arts that were uniquely his. Furthermore, even if he were to use some other powers in future battles, nobody would have found anything off with him. Other than that, he was indeed genuinely interested in furthering his training to improve his powers and to comprehend the Great Path better. He was already capable of moving towards sainthood at present, after all. Godslayer Sword. Sword Sutra of the Void. Futian found several books on swordsmanship and flipped through them. All of them were sword arts that allowed the user to attack spiritual will directly. Among the techniques found within the Godslayer Sword was the Godslayer Sword Matrix. Futian thought that might have been something that he had experienced quite a while ago. The 9 mighty ones that Li Yao sent to participate in the sacred war all those years ago used that sword techniques, which allowed them to kill gods. He flipped through several other books on footwork, which he found useful for disguising the footwork of Xianyuan. Some of the methods found in the upper floors of the library were hardly any weaker than those found in the Golden Hall of the Lotus in Emperor Xia's palace. Due to having the highest level of clearance, he was able to browse the most powerful methods of training available in the library. Yi Futian spent days training in the library. When he came to develop some realization, he went on to sit in a corner and develop them further. While it was impossible for him to unleash any powers in the library itself, he was nonetheless able to simulate them in his life palace. Yi Futian walked out of the library after training for many days. Many of the students were astonished to find that the seventh swordsman was indeed a maniac of the sword, who was after nothing but furthering his path and his art in swordsmanship further. However, to Yi Futian, since he was already peerless below the saints at his current state, and he was also a student of the imperial advisor, there was indeed little that he sought after. Yi Futian looked for information on Nanjai's training ground as soon as he left the library and came to the second brother. Yan Yuan once said that if he needed answers on furthering his path, he would look for Nanjai. Nanjai was painting and looking carefree and peaceful when Yi Futian came where he was. I heard that you are of supreme state of mind. You indeed look carefree and unbridled, Yi Futian mumbled to himself deep down, getting ready to evaluate Nanjai's artwork. However, when he did come look at the painting that Nanjai was working on, he felt as if he went to the wrong person. The strokes were unruly and in a total mess, without any rules or traditions that one was able to find in most artwork. He was unable to tell what Nanjai was painting. What do you think of my work, little brother? Nanjai asked. Good, Yi Futian said. How so? Nanjai smiled and looked at Yi Futian. Good in the sense that I'm unable to see anything from it, Yi Futian replied earnestly. Nanjai was dumbfounded, but then smiled and nodded. You speak truthfully. He then put his brush down and looked at Yi Futian, asking, I've heard that you've been spending days training in the library. What brings you here today? Brother, I've come to comprehend multiple wills of the great path in my training, enabling me to merge them to become my own and turn them into my attacks, but I'm still unable to get to Saint Plain. I even think that Saint Plain seems to be very far away from me, and I'm unable to find the way in. Yi Futian continued, I'm here to ask for your guidance. Sainthood is flawless. What does flawless mean in this case? My brother, Nanjai then looked at Yi Futian and said with a solemn tone, You have comprehended many wills of the great path, and you are peerless below the saints. Why do you need to be in a hurry to reach sainthood? Seeking the path is tiring, and there are countless in the Dali Academy that talk about you. I'm sure that there are many very beautiful girls among the students who have taken a liking to you. If you're willing to talk to them about life, it would be wondrous. Don't you think? Yi Futian felt that he came to the wrong person. Was this really that Nanjai, that second student of the imperial advisor, who is said to have a transcendental state of mind? Guess I'll just head to the library then. Yi Futian turned around and was about to leave. Gosh, what a waste of those good looks. Nanjai shook his head sighing, then asked, So, what do you think flawless means? One who has no regrets in their mind, and who is devoted to seeking the path.
Yi Futian asked.
Saints notwithstanding, not even the Renhuang, could claim that they have no regrets. Nanjai said, What flawless illustrates is a state of mind. It doesn't speak of being devoid of regrets, but rising above them. Please enlighten me, brother. Yi Futian came to seek guidance earnestly. There is no such thing as a truly perfect state of mind. Be it a doctrine, true self, or unblemished states. None could truly achieve absolute perfection. Nanjai then elaborated, I don't agree to how such states of mind are said to be flawless. I think that the state of mind of saints should be illustrated as transcendental instead. What do you mean?
Yi Futian asked.
Have you heard of the expression of, the mind of a person is measured in square inches? Nanjai asked. I have. Yi Futian nodded. That is the size of a person. There is only so much a place measured in square inches can hold. Although you have comprehended many wills of the great path and use your development for attacks in battle, you're still trapped within that piece of space measured in square inches, and that is why you cannot become a saint. Nanjai then continued, that applies to everyone. The saint plane is a plane that requires all-around elevation. As for transcendence, there are two types to it. One being of deep-rooted persistence, breaking through that space measured in square inches through sheer brute force and meld with the great path. Even if these people could achieve transcendence and become saints, every step they would have taken in the future would be hampered by their states of mind, making it difficult for them to get far on their path of sainthood. An overwhelming majority of such saints would have hit a dead end, their very limit, when they reach the state of true self, never able to move further forever. But then again, if some saints are indeed able to step even further, they would become terrifying beings indeed. Nanjai's words caused Yi Futian to twitch. For some reason, that reminded him of one person, the glass saint. Her deep-rooted hatred and obsession allowed her to break through that space measured in square inches. Even if they were to get to the unblemished stage, such states would still actually be flawed. As such, I believe much more in the other kind of transcendence. Nanjai continued, it is a kind of transcendence that I find difficult to place with words. For instance, you seek the way of the sword. If there shall be a day when you find that you could do with the way of the sword, you would still be practicing the way of the sword, even if you were never to use a sword again, and that would be transcendence. Or, for instance, there is someone who keeps pursuing one thing, but one day, they just found that they became able to put that one thing down, let go, and move on to encompass all. That, too, is transcendence. Or, yet, another example. Someone who spent their life seeking the way was then met with a life and death situation, but found that they became able to let go of everything and see their situation in a tranquil manner. Their state of mind transcended the state of life and death. That, yet again, would be transcendence. This is my take on the matter of transcendence. Everyone has their unique experience with it, but you are in a transcendental state of mind. You will then be able to break through that space measured in square inches, melding your mind with the great path, and achieved the towering, heavenly state of mind. The heavenly path shall then take notice and rain the catastrophe of the great path upon you, Nanjai elaborated slowly. Yi Futian felt insightful and enlightened. He was able to recall several people from Nanjai's elaborations. The number one below saints in Lihan heaven, the edge of pinnacle below Saint Plain, Wang Chuan. He lost to Yi Futian at the 33rd layer of heaven in Lihan heaven on that day. He struggled against his loss in pain, but then chose to let go. He then transcended and merged with the great path. He transcended his ego at that moment. His teacher, Dozhan, fought a life and death battle in the Holy Ji Palace in the 9 states all those years ago. Huang Shi borrowed the will of Ren Huang in the imperial mausoleum to fight. Both of them put their lives aside and transcended everything, enabling them to achieve sainthood. As Nanjai put it, such transcendence was the true state of mind of saints. A space measured in square inches would not have been able to meld with the world. Thank you for your guidance, brother. Yi Futian bowed. That conversation made him realize that the second student of the imperial advisor, Nanjai, was the real deal. Well, we're a family, so no need to be polite about it. As such, don't fuss yourself over too much with seeking the way. Put it aside for a change and to talk to a girl about life. You might be able to achieve that required open state of mind and be on your way to sainthood. Nanjai narrowed his eyes to a slit, smiling, and said. Yi Futian became utterly speechless, then said, I'll look for the third brother next then. He left as soon as he finished. The third student of the imperial advisor, Mu Chunyang, had a totally different personality with Nanjai. His shoulder-length hair had a clean, clear-cut image. The third student of the imperial advisor, Mu Chunyang, had a totally different personality with Nanjai. His shoulder-length hair had a clean, clear-cut image. He was training with his eyes closed when Yi Futian came. Yi Futian stood at the side and waited quietly instead of bothering him. Mu Chunyang was an unblemished saint at the 3rd level of Saint Plane. With extremely rare handful of holiness of nirvana, they were at the pinnacle of the top-notch figures to be found in the dynasty. Even Nanjai was of an inferior state than him. Mu Chunying opened his eyes a short while later and said to Yi Futian, "Little brother, 3rd brother, I've just came from 2nd brother's place, and I've asked him something about sainthood. I'm here to experience the will of the great path," Yi Futian said. It was something Yen Yuan told him before. The eldest brother definitely had his reasons to put it that way. He was naturally able to tell that the eldest student of the imperial advisor, Yen Yuan, was of extremely high prestige, right below their teacher.
Yeah.
Mu Chunyang nodded. Your 2nd brother is indeed more carefree. But actually, he proves more than adequate to teach you and to have you experience the great path. Is 2nd brother really just a saint of true self? Yi Futian asked. Nanjai felt to be carefree and unbridled, so his state of mind must have been in excellent condition. One state of mind was of utmost importance when training in Saint Plane. Nanjai should have had very high upper limit instead. Is he really just trapped by his lacking talents, preventing his plane from reaching higher heights? He really is indeed a saint of true self. While teacher said that 2nd brother is rather slow in training and somewhat lacking in talents, but he had the best temperament among us all. If there were to actually be one who became enlightened in just a day, that would have been 2nd brother. Perhaps he might end up being faster in making breakthroughs than any of us. Even I have to ask him for guidance many times after all, Mu Chunyang said. Despite being of higher plane than Nanjai, but he was apparently very respectful of the 2nd brother nonetheless. Is that so? Yi Futian felt rather puzzled. At the very least, his current vista did not allow him to see that far. He was there at Dali Imperial City for 2 reasons, revenge and training on pilgrimage. The trip would have benefited him a lot, even if he did not end up being able to kill Liao. However, that short amount of time Yi Futian spent with the imperial advisor had surprisingly diminished his enmity against the older man. The imperial advisor that he knew back in Emperor Xia's realm and the one he came to know at present were different. That was not to say that the imperial advisor had changed, but that he was able to look from a different perspective due to being of different identity. If you want to experience the will of the great path, I'd like to know if you're ready now. Mu Chunyang asked. Yi Futian's expression had gotten somewhat more serious and then nodded. I'm ready. Mu Chunyang's expression changed entirely, looking extremely sharp. At the very next moment, Yi Futian felt as if everything around him changed, and the world was no longer the same. The will of the blade shrouded their surroundings, and he felt as if he became surrounded by curved blades. His robe billowed, and felt he was about to suffocate. The will of the blade rained down on him directly. The next thing he felt was as if extremely sharp blades around him were coming down him, streaking down on the heavens and landed right before him. His breathing stopped, and was unable to breathe. The will of the blade had gotten increasingly strong, and his entire world seemed to have been turned into the world of the blade. Formless blades bloomed before him and lashed out on him in a frenzy. Heavenly might rained down through the vast region of blades. Yi Futian felt himself to be insignificant, as if he was but a chestnut floating at sea. However, Mu Chunying never budged throughout the entire time. He simply sat where he was. At that moment, he lifted his hand forward. Yi Futian was able to sense clearly in that split second that the region of blades was held by him in that very moment. He took control of that supreme power in that space simply by extending his hand. When one becomes a saint, their mind merges with that of the cosmos. The path is the nature, and the person becomes the path, reigning over the heavens and the earth. Mu Chunyang's voice was heard. He flicked lightly with his finger, sending boundless will of the blades sweeping by Yi Futian like devastating storms. However, all of that dissipated within mere moments, as if nothing had been there in the first place.
Who?
Yi Futian exhaled for quite some time, feeling refreshed. He had been in hell for one moment, and in heaven the next. The saint plane was one of transcendence. The mind, which had been one measured merely in square inches, became towering, encompassing the entire world, mastering the way of the cosmos. "Thank you, brother," Yi Futian said. Mu Chunyang's blade will felt exceptionally strong to him, and the impact was very direct. "Yeah." Mu Chunyang nodded. "But then again, sages becoming saints are something that would naturally happen. It isn't something that happens overnight, and not something that comes just because one is extra hardworking at it. It'd be best that you place higher emphasis in how you develop your comprehension. You're now half a saint, and pure training is of little help by now." Yi Futian nodded. That was how cultivation was. One might have experienced it, one might have seen it, one might have even been able to wrap their head around it, but one still might not have been able to achieve it. That was how mystical planes were. There would not have been countless who were stuck below saint levels, not being able to pass into the next phase otherwise. Yi Futian was able to comprehend multiple wills of the Great Path, which was a testament of his uncanny talents at cultivation. It was worth noting that he had never ran into much obstacles at such stages, but countless in the 9 states were shut out altogether by those stages. "I should take my leave, brother. I would come here to comprehend further in the future," Yi Futian said. "You're welcomed here any time." Mu Chunyang nodded, and Yi Futian left. Since he had become a student of the imperial advisor of Dali, he would have gone with the flow and trained in silence, making his way to achieve sainthood. As for killing Li Yao, timing was of the utmost importance, as the prince was not someone he could have killed just because he wanted to. If he were to continue training under the imperial advisor, the chance would have presented itself sooner or later. At that moment, Li Yao showed up at Dali Academy. Yi Futian ran into Li Yao when he was returning to the library of the Dali Academy. "Seven swordsmen," Li Yao called. "What business do you have with me, Your Highness?" Yi Futian walked up to him and asked. His tone was unusually calm despite his enemy being right in front of him, without any signs of emotional fluctuations showing. "Right?" Li Yao smiled and nodded. "You remember the sword of Cassiopeia?" "Naturally," Yi Futian said. Both the 7 sins and Di Hao used the sword of Cassiopeia, and it was indeed formidable. King Tiandao's people sent the sword techniques to the palace, and I specifically had it copied, ready to be stored at the highest level of the library. "Well, you're versed in the arts of space, and you could train in the sword of Cassiopeia's techniques. That should do a lot in strengthening and completing your way of the sword," Li Yao smiled and said. Emperor Li ruled over everything in Dali dynasty. King Tiandao was an elder brother of Emperor Li himself. King Tiandao had acquired the supposedly lost art of the sword of Cassiopeia, and both Di Hao and the 7 sins had used them in public. As such, it was natural that King Tiandao sent a copy to the Emperor Li's palace. However, Li Yao brought it to the Dali Academy shortly after. One could have only imagined how would King Tiandao have felt about it. But then again, King Tiandao's reactions were rather predictable. The people of Dali Mountain were irritated specifically because Dali Academy had too much access to cultivation resources of Dali dynasty. As for Li Yao, he was originally a student of the imperial advisor in name. Yuan Jin died in battle for his sake in the Battle of Empty Realm as well. Under such circumstances, he naturally would have chosen to get closer with the imperial advisor's people. He had maintained a very amicable relationship with Yuan Jin. With Yi Futian being the newest student and of the same generation as he was, he saw fit to get on Yi Futian's good side and become friends with the newcomer. "Thank you for your effort, Your Highness," Yi Futian said. "Well, let's head first to the arena, instead of the library. We'll have you take a look at the sword of Cassiopeia first." Li Yao took Yi Futian's arm and led him forward, as if they were really close friends, and he did not seem to care that he was a prince in the first place. Yi Futian took one look at the arm and went along with Li Yao. If it had not been for what Li Yao did, and that Yi Futian was the 7th swordsman, the 7 swordsmen might have actually become friends with the prince. However, some things were predestined. He and Li Yao were irreconcilable enemies, and only one of them would have came out alive if they were to clash. Li Yao's intention to kill him was not any less intense than his towards Li Yao. Yi Futian sat on the ground cross-legged at the area, circled by sword wills all around him. The sword of Cassiopeia was particular about controlling sword will with one's will, materializing said will into tangible forms and fusing will of great path into it, enabling one's will to be able to wield the manifested blade perfectly. Yi Futian possessed the perfect requirements for training in the sword of Cassiopeia, and he was a swordsman himself. It did not take him long after comprehending the sword techniques that the sword will around him coalesced in a frenzy, turning into dazzling, leaf-shaped sword, which rang as it pulsed with formidable will of great path of space. Go! Yi Futian extended his hand and swiped. His will activated, and the sword of Cassiopeia streaked through the air. The will of his entire being flew with the blade, maintaining tight control on the blade's movements. This is something, Li Yao exclaimed, feeling impressed. That sword of Cassiopeia that streaked through the air circled around him, ringing at deafening high pitches. At that moment, a beam of cold light flashed by, and the space seemed to have been torn apart, and a sword burst through the air. Li Yao felt his entire being shivering in coldness right there, and then,
Vroom.
The sword appeared right before Li Yao, mere inches away from his throat. It would have taken Yi Futian only one intention to have the sword pierce right through the prince's throat. Li Yao's expression turned serious. His heart raced at that brief moment. He only let out a bitter smile and shook his head when he saw the blade flew upwards and circled around the space right above him. He was rather baffled by how shaken he was. It was impossible for the seventh swordsman to kill him right there. And then, after all, Your Highness, I was just thinking of showcasing how precise my control of the sword of Cassiopeia was to you. I beg your forgiveness, Yi Futian said, but his tone hardly sounded apologetic, behaving just as boisterous and unruly as the seventh swordsman had been known to be. In that brief moment back then, he had actually really wanted to stuck the blade into Li Yao's throat and taking his revenge. However, he bit down on the urge nonetheless. He had molded the wild, unruly image of the seventh swordsman specifically for Li Yao, but he had never expected Li Yao to deliberately get close to him and buy him over. It was different from how he planned it, but that hardly mattered. If he were to make a move right there, and kill Li Yao, he would have succeeded easily, but he would have also died a horrible death for it. That was apparently not how he wanted things to be. No matter. Li Yao smiled dismissively and said, That attack is indeed fast, as expected of the sword of Cassiopeia indeed. If it was to be used in battle, one attack would have been enough to cut someone's throat off. Furthermore, that all comes from the first sword materialized. Your Highness, the sword of Cassiopeia requires extremely powerful control to wield. That was just one blade. If there were to be more, control wouldn't have been so easy, and I doubt control could have been at such precision, Yi Futian replied. Well, I believe you would be able to pull it off somehow with your talents. Li Yao gave his approval. Yi Futian spent some more time training after that. When he came to have solid control with the sword of Cassiopeia, he left together with Li Yao. One could have only imagined how Li Yao would have felt about things if he were to found out that he was helping Yi Futian train. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.